Fidelity. What's it cost to invest with the Fidelity app?
Start with as little as $1 with no account fees or trade commissions on U.S. stocks and ETFs.
That's music to my ears.
I can only talk.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Zero account fees apply to retail brokerage accounts only. Sell order assessment fee not included. A limited number of ETFs are subject to a transaction-based service fee of $100. See full list at fidelity.com/commissions. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Canada did what? A podcast from Postmedia. Uncover the untold stories of the Canadian history you might think you remember with me, Tristan Hopper. From one prime minister's crazy camaraderie with communists to the war over metric conversion and the harrowing reality of the October crisis. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts.
How do you take a sense of how the world is working, how Canada-U.S. relations are working in what is a moment of absolute chaos? Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host, and we have been talking an awful lot about Canada-U.S. relations, about Donald Trump, his impact on the world, Justin Trudeau leaving the stage, and, well, we expect Mark Carney taking over. Conrad Black is someone who has been around the Canadian political and business establishment for decades, going back to the 1960s, and has known many of the great players. In fact, he wrote a book about Donald Trump called A President Like No Other. He knew Pierre Trudeau, he knows Justin Trudeau, he knows the folks involved. And what is his take on this? So beyond the fact that he started National Post, used to own a good chunk of what is now called Postmedia, wanted to reach out to him because of his experience on all of this. How does he view how the current government has handled things? How does he view how Trump is handling things? The Canadian media? What is happening when it comes to Ukraine? The relationship between the United States, Russia, and the attempt to push China off to the side rather than allow them to continue to be an aggressor and a challenger to American power in the world. Conrad Black, Justin Trudeau is about to leave. By the time we're talking on Thursday afternoon, by the time this is posted Monday morning, there's going to be a new Liberal leader. We presume Mark Carney. We'll get into that in a moment. Who knows? But there will be a new Liberal leader. But Trudeau has been managing this Trump file, the whole tariff issue, since the threats began on November 25th. So I want to start with that. How would you rate his performance? How has he done so far? Because whether we like him or not, whether we think he should have left long ago or not, he has been the prime minister and he's been the one managing the file until this point.
Yeah, you're asking me how he's done on this present issue or overall over the last year?
On the present issue.
I think not badly, but I think he precipitated part of the problem when he said, well, if you proceed, when he went down to have dinner with him in Palm Beach and said,
which I thought was a good move, but maybe you took the wrong message.
I'm not one of these people who criticize him for going there. I mean, the problem arises, you go straight to it, and nothing wrong with that. But when he said, well, something, according to Trump, he said, if these tariffs are imposed, our economy will collapse. Well, that's not the right thing to say in general. It's technically not the right thing to say. And I think it incited in Trump the view that Canada is a much less resolute country than it is. And so I think that was a tactical error. But beyond that, I think he's been fine. I think particularly he's been wise to not to argue the whole thing out in the public. I mean, that was the problem with that Zelensky business. The conversation that they had there should not have been in front of the whole world, in particular in front of the Kremlin. But here, I think he's done a good job coordinating with the premiers, and he's been relatively judicious. Obviously, it was a somewhat contentious session they had on the telephone yesterday, and he said it was colorful or something like that. I think
some expletives, I understand. Who has ever heard of grown men swearing at each other?
I doubt if they swore at each other. I think they would have used adjectives and references to other things. I do not believe that those. I know both those men, and I don't believe they would swear at each other. Say, you son of a bitch or something like that. They wouldn't do that.
It would be more about swearing about the dairy or some, perceived protectionist measure.
Some slightly coarse adjective to an object, to an inanimate thing. These goddamn tariffs or something, that sort of thing. But Trump is not. He's a plain-spoken and blunt man, but he's not particularly vulgar. I mean, he swears a lot less than people who are otherwise public statesmen who are otherwise generally more mild-mannered than him.
Yeah, I mean, you know him better than I don't know him at all. I know Justin Trudeau. I don't know Donald Trump at all.
The funny thing is, like a lot of these New Yorkers, he takes Yiddish words and uses them. Like Bernie was schlong and stuff like. I mean, they're colorful words, and you sort of know by the sound of them what they mean. And that's. But I don't think he would do that with Justin. But he's not a guy who swears a lot.
Now, my view over the past little while, and I'd like to see if you share this viewpoint with me, is that since Trump announced these threats, November 25th. I remember I was about to go to the United States, and I was going for two separate trips, one to Tampa for a couple of weeks, one to Palm Springs in California for a few weeks, and the threat comes out on Truth Social. We're going to put you 25% tariffs. If you don't fix everything, you're done. Wow, okay, we're going to the Forex right now. We're going to get some American cash before the Canadian dollar tanks in the morning. Thank goodness that hasn't really happened. It's gone down a little bit, but not a lot. But since then, what I have felt has happened is that there have been far too many Canadian politicians who want to run and get in front of a camera or a microphone and denounce Trump rather than look to find a way to say, okay, do you have an actual grievance? Do you have a problem that we can fix? Is there a way so that Canada wins? Do you agree with that? Or do you think that most Canadian politicians have been, looking to do the best for the country rather than trying to use anti-American, anti-Trump sentiment among voters to boost themselves?
I think it's been a mixed bag, Brent. I think that, for example, Doug Ford dissolved the Ontario Parliament and had an election, sort of running as Captain Canada. I'll defend, and nothing was really happening. Trump extended the deadline during the election period, as it turned out, and that wasn't the issue here. The issue was, has Ford's government done a competent job? And you didn't see a lot of signs out in people's lawns, and it was not the kind of weather where people like going out campaigning very much. And it was a kind of under-recognized election, but there was no great issue against him, and he was reelected. But the idea, I'm going to, arm myself with a mandate to fight tooth and nail against these tariffs. It fizzled. I mean, if he was saying that, it wasn't much publicized. But I think that it is very injudicious of Carney to be out campaigning for the Liberal leadership, criticizing Trump personally, and making really rather snide remarks about him personally, and criticizing the American political system. And that has absolutely nothing to do with running for Liberal leader. So I think it's a hokey sideshow, and I doubt if it impresses people very much. In the case, you see, Trump's technique is he always starts with a sort of shock and awe surprise to try and get an edge in any discussion or controversy is going to engage in. And then he conducts himself with an unpredictable level of syncopated changes, but he is careful not to become the guy saying, I dare you to cross this line, and then I dare you to cross this line, and so on. So these delays that he's making are not going to go on forever. He doesn't actually want a tariff war, and in my opinion, the weakness of the arguments that some of his spokespeople are making indicate that they want to settle this fairly quickly. I mean, I saw Peter Navarro follow Doug Ford on Fox News. I think it was last night, but it might have been.
It was Wednesday night, yeah.
Yeah, and it was very weak what he said. I mean, complaining about fentanyl coming from Canada, it is 1/500th of the quantity that comes in from Mexico. But it's rubbish. I mean, the fact is every country has the right and the duty to put whatever level of security it considers appropriate on its own border. That was Trump's complaint about Biden. They let millions of people come in and didn't even take their names. Weren't aware they were coming in, other than in general, as they saw, they saw the impact of it in ultimately all the American cities. And it's up to the United States to put whatever level of security it wants on both its borders. And you see the number of people entering the country illegally in the United States has declined by 96% in 6 weeks. I had occasion to say to President Trump a few days ago, he phones me occasionally, like he does hundreds of people. I'm no great intimate of his, but he's got hundreds of people all over the world he phones from time to time just to get opinions, just to get different views, you see. And I said, look, we're not East Germany here. We don't have a wall preventing people from leaving or preventing goods from leaving. And if you have a complaint about what's coming from this country into your country, I mean, it's your border, you deal with it. and I said it very politely, naturally. And then it's all a pretext, I think. And it's not going to go on very long. He's not angry at Canada, and he doesn't want a war of any kind with Canada.
I mean, I hope not. Look, though, I will look at the numbers and I'll say that, we do have a fentanyl problem in this country that we should have taken seriously without Donald Trump telling us to do it. As Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has pointed out, more than 49,000 people have died in this country from fentanyl overdoses. We've seen that the triads and the cartels are laundering their money in Vancouver and Toronto.
Sure.
This is a major problem.
Indeed, in a Canadian bank in the United States.
Yeah, and we are becoming an export country. I mean, the Globe and Mail did this. The Canadian media is a bit bizarre at times. Look, I'm part of it. I've long been a part of it, but I've also long been a critic. The United States says we have a problem with fentanyl from Canada. And then the Globe and Mail is like, oh, no, we're not exporting fentanyl to America. Mm-hmm. We're sending it to Australia. As if that's any great thing. Like, no, we should not have super labs here that are exporting fentanyl to anywhere, and we should be taking care of this issue. But we've had a government that has had a very bizarre view on narcotics in my view of the world. That was leaning towards handing out opioid pills, was leaning towards decriminalization of all hard drugs. That has not helped us in this discussion, I don't think.
Let me ask you this. You would know this better than I, but am I right that to some extent we've suffered from these people who poured across the southern border of the United States, then crossing into Canada and operating a drug export business back into the U.S.? Is this a myth, or is this going on? My impression is it is happening to some extent.
To some extent, that is happening. And then the Americans do have a fair complaint on the increase in illegal crossing. I mean, there never used to be any illegal crossings going from Canada into the United States. And then we open up the temporary foreign worker program, the foreign student program, and suddenly you've got, within 1 year, 43,000 Indian nationals being stopped going from Canada into the United States, declaring asylum and all these things. And the Americans start saying, hey, wait a minute, what did you do oh, well, it's our own internal immigration changes that we made that led to this. So they're not without complaint. I think it's overblown.
Yes.
In terms of how they're reacting to it. But you mentioned Peter Navarro. I mean, I interviewed Navarro years ago several times on his book, Death by China. He is a hawk. He is a big tariff supporter. You've got folks that believe that tariffs are the best way to deal with things. You're someone that's done business on both sides of the border. What is your view on this new love affair with tariffs, whether it's Navarro, Lutnick, Lighthizer, any of them?
Has it in his mind that he started out saying, and looking at it, and he has actually looked at it quite carefully, and he sees that with I believe the total is 80 different countries, which is essentially all of the countries that have a significant export economy, that the tariff placed by those countries on the United States is much higher than the tariff placed by the United States on those countries. So he feels that is an inequality. The U.S.'s pocket is being picked, and he's going to equalize it. Now,
and that's fair, but that's not Canada in the United States, right?
Position, yeah. I mean,
but that's not us and the Americans. That's like Germany or India.
Yeah. Sure. No, India is one of the worst offenders, as he points out. And he feels that as with the slackers in paying their fees at NATO, I'm paying, maintaining their defense budgets, and Canada's one of the worst, as you know, that everyone just got accustomed to taking advantage of the U.S. and letting the U.S. do the heavy lifting. And he wants to change that. But then a kind of an overdrive clicked in on his judgment of the tariff issue. And he got it into his mind that it could be a big revenue producer for the federal government and help reduce the budget deficit. Because, he's there where he's pledged to reduce taxes. He's pledged to build the military sufficiently to ensure continuing U.S. naval superiority over China and equals or greater sophistication in hypersonic missiles. So these things are expensive. And he's given all sorts of promise them verbally, but he will follow through them. And these tax exemptions on tips and, first responders.
As far as a vote getter, can you think of anything better than no tax on tips?
Yeah, brilliant. No, it's brilliant.
It just retail politics, right?
Oh, he's a great politician. And Art Laffer is right up to a point. And, the Lyndon Johnson tax cuts showed it, and the Reagan tax cuts showed it. If you cut taxes, activity goes up so much that you do get most of that back in revenue, or even more.
I used to run a chart showing that Canadian tax cuts increased revenue every year when Jean Chrétien was doing it.
Of course they did. Yeah, so from his standpoint, he sees I have to raise the defense budget, and I want to cut taxes. We think economic growth and deregulation will help bring all that revenue back, but DOGE is going to cut costs somewhat. We don't know how much, but they're already in $200 billion or something. It's about 10% of the deficit. It's something, and they just started, but he's now got it in his mind that maybe tariffs would help if we just make tariff levels equal with everybody. Either they bring theirs down so our sales go up, or we bring ours up so our revenues go up. And to the extent that leads to higher costs domestically, that will be, that'll be counterbalanced by reduced energy costs, as we're going to increase the supply of oil and so on. And so he's got it in there as a budgetary thing too. Now, I don't know how accurate that is. I've never known tariffs to be a serious percentage of a government of a fully full range economy like the United States.
That's because you're too young. You got to go back to 1930 something
century. I mean, between the Civil War and the First World War, the great issue in every American election was the Republicans wanted high tariffs to raise profits and create employment, and the Democrats wanted low tariffs to keep prices low for the working class that voted for them. So you had the two, and if you've looked at it, the popular vote, until the Democratic Party got into bimetallism, which was really funny money, and the country didn't like it, the popular vote was very close between those parties. I mean, for example, in 1880, Garfield defeated Hancock, the Democratic candidate, by 9,000 votes out of nearly 10 million. I mean, they were very close elections.
So are tariffs now just part of the new system? Do we need to get used to this? And I'll give you this example. Ahead of the premier's trip to Washington, which I went down and I followed the premiers and I spoke to several Americans, I was looking and I'm seeing Democrats and Republicans talking about the idea of a universal tariff. Now, not this 25% thing, which is hugely problematic for our economy.
Yes. Yeah.
But perhaps the American government goes to a 10% universal tariff on everyone. And I even spoke to Senator Kevin Cramer from North Dakota, who is very tight with Trump, but also very much a friend of Canada, who said, yeah, there's some merit to this, and this could be a potential way for new revenue. It seems like there is a reawakening of this idea, an openness to this idea that we may find abhorrent, but that they're saying, this could work for us.
There's no doubt the administration and the president himself are seriously considering this as a way to raise revenue. Now, of course, in the Canadian side of things, the unspoken element is, you can always deal with the tariff to some degree by adjusting your currency. Now we've got to be a little careful here. Our dollar is quite low compared to the American dollar now, and the historical range
far too low.
Yeah, so we've got to be careful tanking it further, but or we'll go under 60 cents US, which is that's not a good thing for us. But the United States could reduce the value of the dollar against, the euro and the yen, for example, a little bit if it wanted to. It has the room to do that. So they may be thinking it's hard to tell, but I think the new Secretary of the Treasury is a very able man, Besant, and I think they're experimenting a bit. So to some extent, they're taking a tactical position. We don't want people picking our pocket, even friends of ours like Canada. And by the way, what I as a Canadian object to is us being put in the same box with Mexico.
Yeah,
the U.S.
absolutely.
has real grievance with Mexico, and not only over the illegal immigration, but over the systematic attempt of the Mexicans to induce American companies to shut down factories in the U.S., take a subsidy to rebuild those factories 10 miles inside the Mexican-U.S. border, Mexican side, obviously, get a tax holiday on their income, exploit cheap Mexican labor, and ship the product under the free, NAFTA back into the United States. I mean, that's not fair trading, but we don't do that.
I'm absolutely furious with both Trump and especially Lutnick, who I thought was going to be a smarter man. Instead, he sounded like a carnival barker and a hype man. And
he's excited to be in Washington.
Yeah, but saying that we're stealing the auto jobs and that the auto plants moved to Canada because there were no unions. I mean, look, General Motors would not exist if it wasn't for Sam McLaughlin's money going down on the train from Oshawa to Detroit to help William Durante build GM.
Durant, yeah.
That's how GM was built. Canadian bagmen sent cash.
And it was the McLaughlin Buick. Do you remember that? That was
So I mean, and look, the industries grew up side by side. So that infuriates me. I understand what you're saying about the Mexican side, though.
Our auto workers, were under Walter Reuther until Bob White took them out. The Canadian auto workers that became an independent union. But if they think we don't have a auto workers union, if Navarro thinks that, he's No,
that was Lutnick, not Navarro. Navarro's smart.
Lutnick is actually a pretty smart man, I think, and quite pro-Canadian too.
He's made a ton of money, but some of his statements lately have been driving me nuts. Speaking of driving me nuts, I got to ask you about Mark Carney. He's going to be taking over soon, we believe, as Liberal leader and Prime Minister. We've got a lot of concerns about tariffs, American tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, and yet his big plan is make the big polluters pay. And when you say, well, what's a big polluter? He says a steel mill. Okay, so you want to shut down Algoma and you want to have DeFasco's ArcelorMittal shift production to Detroit and Ohio. So you're going to lose jobs in Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie, steel mills in Regina, Edmonton, South Montreal. They're all going to be in trouble. How can we say that it's bad for Donald Trump to do this to us, and then a whole bunch of Canadians get excited at a Canadian politician wanting to do the same thing?
Look, I have to say, I think Carney politically would be a disaster. I think it would be a vote for suicide. He is an extremist on the ecological issue, and he is too left-wing for the position he seeks to hold. And he was not a successful governor of the Bank of England. He made a complete mockery of the idea of an independent bank governor that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were so proud of. He immersed the Bank of England in Project Fear, which was this campaign to terrorize the British voters out of voting to leave the European Union. He made dramatic and frenzied statements about the consequences to Britain if this happened, which his successor as governor of the Bank of England has walked back and retracted and apologized for.
He was completely wrong on Brexit, wasn't he?
Completely. But in any case, it's none of the governor of the bank's business to get into what amounts to partisan issues. And also, he turned the Bank of England into an agency for radical environmentalism, and encouraged punishment of countries that were not, or companies, I should say, that were not supporting what he regarded as adequately sustainable targets. He turned it into an advocacy and enforcement operation in ecological matters, and I blame David Cameron in particular for not cracking down on this, because that is not the central bank's business. Their business is monetary policy, and that's what they should do. Any more than, for argument's sake, the Minister of Agriculture should be negotiating defense agreements with NATO countries or something. That's not.
And so you don't think Carney would be good for the Canadian economy in dealing with Trump, even though...
Look, it's not any personal animus. I barely know the man, and he's obviously an intelligent man. And
I can say I do know the man. He's a very smart guy, but my view is he has the wrong policies.
That's it. I think he would be, in policy terms, and it's a straight policy question, not a personal one. I think he would be a disaster, a terrible disaster.
All right, we need to take a quick break. When we come back, I do want to ask you about Pierre Poilievre's plan that he's laid out, but also get into Trump's comments about 51st state, Greenland, Panama, things of Ukraine, all of that, more in moments.
Your snacking routine can get a little dull. Time for an Oikos remix or light and fit remix. Like a crunchy storm of sea salt praline pretzels, dark chocolate, and butter toffee, showering down into a smooth, creamy yogurt. Enjoy 6 remix varieties, 3 Epic Complete Protein Oikos remix options, or 3 craveable light and fit remix options. See remixyogurt.com.
Oh my God, it's the coolest thing ever. Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? Well, check this out. It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic, famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. Seriously. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
BTW FYI. Visit Nexplanon.com RN to learn about Nexplanon. It's an gestural implant, 68 milligrams radiopaque. Or ask your HCP IRL. Okay, TTYL.
Conrad, I've asked you about Mark Carney's position. I've asked you about Justin Trudeau's handling of this. As you look at Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, and they've tried to pivot away from talking about, it's funny, people said, oh, you got to stop talking about the carbon tax. And then, first half of the Liberal leadership race was everyone talking about the carbon tax and how the Liberals would get rid of it. But he did pivot. and he did come up with a Canada First plan. When I look at it, it's far more detailed, at least in what we see in public, than what we've seen from the federal government. What's your assessment?
Quite positive. I agree with what you said. I thought the speech he gave at the Quebec Conservative Conference in Quebec City a little over a year ago was one of the most interesting and original policy statements from a party leader I've heard in this country, going back to Walter Gordon's famous conference at Kingston when the Liberals were out of office and Mr. Diefenbaker was the Prime Minister. That's 60 years ago, a little more.
Wow.
And I think he's very original and quite thoughtful in these things, and very good in housing, for example. I think they've got a genuine plan. It's not just the Liberals are bad. This is what we would do. I think those who are representing him as harsh and reactionary and Trump North and all this stuff, and I have a better opinion of Trump than most Canadians do, but I think that's all rubbish. I think he's sort of the man for the hour. I think he's thought it through carefully, and he's a 5 or 6 term MP, though he's still a young man, and he is. Though he has a French name, he's really an English Canadian, as you know, but he speaks French very well, which Carney does not, and so that's a matter of some electoral implications. I think, I think Pierre, if elected Prime Minister, would hit the ground running with a well thought out plan, and we would reverse a number of trends that are now very worrisome and have been well entrenched the last few years. We're slipping competitively all the time in the scale of per capita income per country. When I was a young man, which I admit was a long time ago, it was between us and the Australians who was next to the United States. I'm leaving out the petro-states and the tax haven states. We're not talking about Monaco or Kuwait here. We're talking about real economies, you see.
Where people actually build stuff and make stuff.
Yeah. And we're slipping. In the end, it's competition. We've got to be competitive. And this country's a treasure house. We have everything except tropical fruit here. Precious metals, base metals, forest products, agriculture, energy of all kinds. We got everything. And we have a population now of over 40 million, greater than France at the greatest days of its glory with Renoir and Victor Hugo. And we don't have cultural figures like that, but we have that population. And we're underachieving, and we've just got to raise our game here. We've, as you would know, Brian, we've had in the last 10 years approximately a $350 billion deficit. That's to say, more money leaving the country that was generated here than money invested from outside. You can't go on like that forever.
Oh, you definitely can't. Now, unfortunately, I hear a lot of Canadians say to me that, well, I can't vote for Pierre Poilievre. He's mean. He's nasty. He's angry. And so I was interested to hear you say that you don't see that. Now, I'll be upfront. I've known him since his first election. He used to be my MP. I've known him personally more than 20 years, and I see a very different man than other people do.
That's I've known him a long time, not quite as long as that, but almost as long as that. And
he's an affable guy who laughs a lot.
Yeah.
So you don't see him as this angry, elbows up, kill the opponent person all the time.
That's liberal NDP propaganda.
Well, but I also think a lot of the media.
The guy who was a bit like that was Justin's father. Now, I liked him, actually. Even though I disagreed with him in many ways, I'm from Quebec, and I wanted, he was the man to defeat the separatists, and he did it. But Pierre Trudeau was not Mr. Generosity,
I've heard stories about Pierre Trudeau calling up you to, tell you to fire that SOB who worked for you, Jim Munson. So I worked for CFRB, which of course you owned many years ago, long before I worked there. But I heard stories that Pierre used to call up and demand you fire people like Jimmy Munson.
No, well, other politicians have done that too. The worst I ever had for that was when Margaret Thatcher phoned me at 2:00 in the morning and demanded, which is funny, I don't go to bed early, so it wasn't so inconvenient as would be for most people, but she was shouting down the phone. I had to hold the phone out here, you think, demanding I fire the editor of the Daily Telegraph because he had fired her daughter. So I said, well, look, Prime Minister, I can't get to the bottom of that right now, but will you leave it with me until noon later today? So that was the end. And we sorted it all out. But yeah, I said to Max Hastings, "Are you out of your mind?" He said, "Well, she did something she shouldn't have done." I said, "But come on, Max, it's the Prime Minister's daughter. Are you crazy?"
Certain things you got to look past. Let me ask you about this, about people in the media, before we move on to the international side of things. Some of our media commentators in this country have been losing their collectivist little minds, as I like to say, over Donald Trump. You've got Andrew Coyne suggesting...
He flipped completely, I'm afraid. And Andrew is a relative of mine. I'm sorry to say it, but...
Oh, I did not know that. My apologies.
I think he's flipped his cork.
He's saying we've got to get out of NATO. We got to kick U.S. out of NATO. Ban Trump from the GN.
President to come to a G7.
G7.
I mean, he's just gone mad.
Stephen Marr is saying we've got to start conscription to stop the pending U.S. invasion. There's a huge chunk of the so-called respectable commentariat class. And look, I write for the Toronto Sun. I will never be part of the respectable commentariat class. I'll have a big audience. I will have influential people read me, listen to the podcast and all of that, but I won't be part of the respectable side. The respectable side has lost their mind over Trump.
Yes. But the Trump derangement syndrome is a well-known phenomenon now. And all manner, and of course, it's mainly Americans, but there are foreigners, including Canadians like this too. And they are... and I know, as you do, a great many of them. And what they remind me of is nothing so much as people who, as if there was a little trap door in their foreheads. And when the name Trump is mentioned, other than in the context of playing bridge or something, the door flies open and this cuckoo bird flies out, preaching absolute nonsense, and then goes back in and slams the door. And that's what you get. And I don't understand it. He's obviously... whatever, reservations one might have about him, he's a very formidable man, a very important president, and a great figure in the world. He's by far the most influential and important person in the world right now, and his record is not difficult to defend. I mean, in 6 weeks, illegal entries down 96%, recruitment in the armed forces up 20%. Spending cut $250 billion of sheer waste, just nonsense,
Oh, there's many things I like about what he's doing. I don't like what he's doing with Canada.
No, neither do I, and I've told him that.
So let me ask you about this. A little while ago, as I mentioned, down in Washington, I reconnected with Steve Bannon, who used to head up Breitbart. That's how I got to know Steve, but he went into the White House as Trump's chief strategist, I believe was his title. And I said, okay, you still know the guy, you're not tight anymore, but what's going on? And he tied together Canada, Greenland, the Panama Canal into this Western hemispheric defense strategy. He's invoking the name of Alfred Mann, who was this naval strategist from
Admiral
1800s.
Thayer, man. But he was the influence of sea power upon history.
He's a very important guy, but
extremely important. But that has absolutely nothing to do with Canada.
Do you put any stock in that theory that, because we can't defend our Arctic, that, we haven't built Grays Bay, which is the commercial port. We haven't built a proper deep water naval port in the Arctic.
We didn't launch the great icebreaker John Diefenbaker that Stephen Harper promised. We didn't build any of the 10 nuclear submarines for the Arctic that Brian Mulroney wanted to commission, and we're not pulling our weight. And I think Trump has a legitimate point. Now, the U.S. is an Arctic power. Alaska is part of the United States, and their Navy is active up there. But as in other military matters and alliance matters, we should be pulling our weight, and we're not doing it. So in that respect, I think Trump and the British who are doing all right, and some of those who are closer to the Russians geographically, like the Poles, those NATO members that are pulling their weight have a grievance with us, and we should respond to it. But Admiral Mahan doesn't have a thing to do with this, and Steve Bannon says that he does. That's horse feathers. But he was the influence of sea power upon history was one of the most influential strategic books ever written, but it has nothing to do with our position. Now,
Do you put any stock in the 51st state idea that Trump is floating, or
well,
is that?
I did point out to him that in the first place, since we have more people in California, we're entitled to more senators in the state of Delaware. But I told him that it would have to be 6 states, but Canadians weren't interested. They didn't want American crime rates. They didn't want American gun laws. They didn't want the corrupt American justice system that no one knows better than Trump himself.
Or yourself.
Yeah.
You dealt with that.
But on the other hand, there's room for collaboration beyond what we have now. But I think what's happening here is there's separate questions. I mean, if I can break them out very briefly. In the case of Panama, he is justly concerned that American flag ships are being overcharged, American Navy ships are being overcharged to go through the canal, and that the Chinese are at each end of the canal, and he is
that's the big one.
He's forcing the Chinese out, and he is going to force them out. I mean, Roosevelt did that in Mexico when the Japanese were buying up a lot of land in Baja California. He warned the president of Mexico he wouldn't stand for it. But he didn't do it publicly. He didn't want to embarrass him, and the Mexicans took care of it. But on Greenland, again, he's right. Denmark doesn't have the money to do what needs to be done there, which is partially Arctic, protecting our position in the Arctic, and partially the ultimate mineral wealth of Greenland. So I don't know that the way the president of the U.S. has pursued this is the right course. Just announcing in public he wants to buy it. I mean, I think there are better ways of dealing with that kind of thing. But that's a matter of making the most out of Greenland. You don't have to take it away from Denmark. But Denmark it's a fine place, but it's only 5 million people, and they don't have the means to do what needs to be done in Greenland.
Which is why China has been coming in, and they've foolishly been allowing China to come in.
Yeah, well, you see, the biggest part of that puzzle is in Ukraine, and I give Trump full credit for this. He is the only Western leader who has said all along, we've got 2 objectives there. We can't have Russia taking over Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine has a perfect right, with some revision of borders, to recognize Russia's historic position and the Russian partial composition of a population, about 1/6 of it. They have some rights about Ukraine. So there's an argument for revision of borders. But Ukraine, having decided it does not want to be part of Russia, which it was for 300 years, they have that right. And in any case, we don't want to yield back the largest single piece of our great historic bloodless victory in the Cold War. And we don't want the Western alliance to be exposed as a paper tiger. So we've got to protect basically Ukraine with some concessions to Russia. And secondly, we've got to create the conditions where it is in Russia's interest not to be in a smothering of them embrace with China, and be back as an independent entity. See, the real danger here.
And so that's what I think most people don't get, is that the attempt to reach out to Putin is like almost everything else Trump is doing right now related to China and countering China.
Yeah. Well, China's the only possible rival they've got. Now, in the end, China is no match for the United States. It is not as powerful a country, and it never will be. But if you got, heaven forbid, if you got the Chinese, by agreement with the Kremlin, shipping 40 or 50 million surplus Chinese up into Siberia and exploiting those resources and paying a royalty to Russia, we would be facing a much more powerful China. We'd be facing a China that, unlike the present China, would be resource rich. And that would make it a much more dangerous competitor. And the price Russia would pay would be basically a royalty collecting formerly great power like Turkey or Spain or something. It wouldn't really be a major power anymore. And that's what we want to avoid.
Is the way that Trump is going about this with Ukraine, with Canada, is he making it so that he's alienating people, and allies now feel like they can't trust the White House? They can't trust the United States.
No, I don't detect that last point. I mean, I thought Macron and Starmer got on very well there last week. He was very polite to them. They were very polite to him. Again, as it happened, I spoke to him earlier this week, and he said he had excellent visits with both of them. And look, the fact is,
I think Zelensky played his hand very badly. I don't want to get into the cards argument, but he had one goal, and that was to sign the minerals deal.
Yeah, look, he said he would sign it with Besant when he went to Kiev. That's what the Treasury Secretary went there for. Then he said, no, I'll sign it at the Munich Security Conference. He didn't do that. Then he requested the visit to Washington. As you saw, Trump greeted him at the front door of the White House. He came out the door outside, greeted him outside in the cold, without an overcoat on, and welcomed him in. Very, jovial conversation. And so it went for some while. And then with all the cameras on, Zelensky got into these things that shouldn't have been discussed in public. He wanted to make those points. You don't do it with Putin sitting in the Kremlin watching you live on TV as you do it. I think they've sorted all that out now, and I think
hopefully, yes.
Look, Trump is the only person. Let's remember two things. One, nobody was talking about peace in Ukraine until he was reinaugurated 6 weeks ago. Nobody. Not a word. Not Biden will, as long as it takes. We'll just keep sending them ammunition and weapons until there are no living Ukrainians to pull the triggers anymore. And now we're obviously very close to a peace, and that's Trump's doing. But the second thing is he's the only one who can produce the peace. He can say, as he undoubtedly has to Zelensky, look, this is what I can get for you. This is the best you can do. Take 3/4 of a loaf. And he can also say to Putin, if you don't take this, I'm giving Zelensky weapons that will bring this war home to civilian Russians the way you've done it to Ukrainians. And don't give me any of your bunk about nuclear weapons. I have nuclear weapons too, and you're not going to use them because you're not insane. Because if you do, an awful lot of Russians are going to die.
Let me leave you with this. I've looked at the map and where the minerals are, where they aren't, and I know that many of them are within Russian-controlled areas right now. And when I look at what they've talked about out of the White House about the peace deal, and I look at where the minerals are, I think, okay, that's Trump's way of saying to Putin, you're going to give that land back because I just signed on to own those mineral rights. So I own them, not you. Give the land back. Do you take it the same way?
That, and we will have substantial numbers of important Americans, not random tourists, but a large group of sophisticated American specialists in that country. And if they are put in harm's way by your aggression, you are deliberately provoking us. You see, that's where I part company with Zelensky. I mean, I know he's fought a brave battle there. I don't know all this business about corruption, and I don't know anything about that, but he's put up a hell of a fight and led a brave people in a gallant task. As Mr. Churchill said of the Finns and the Greeks in 1940 and 41, that they've shown the world what free men can do, and you've got to respect that. But Zelensky, has to realize that with Americans in country in that minerals deal, with British and French peacekeepers in significant numbers, durably in Ukraine, they're both nuclear powers, they're both close allies of the U.S., and with Article 5 still in effect, meaning that if British and French forces are attacked in Syria by Russia, they can call upon the U.S. under Article 5, and the United States would reply to an attack on Britain and France. That they would certainly do. He's got all the security he needs. I mean, he came into this with none. The Russians just piled into his country, but Joe Biden's initial response was, since that half-wit chairman of the Joint Chiefs I had, Chief of Staff of the Army, Milley, said, they'll take over all Ukraine in a month and Kiev within about 10 days, none of which happened, of course. I mean, what great triumph of military intelligence that was. And instead of that, he will have British and French forces there, American specialist mining engineers there, and the NATO arrangements in place if the British and French find themselves exchanging live fire with the Russians. I mean, that is security. Russia's in no position to attack the British and French, let alone the Americans.
What did the Polish Prime Minister say the other day? He said, we face the prospect that 500 million Europeans have to ask 300 million Americans to defend against 140 million Russians. There's a lot of bizarre things going on. Conrad Black, fascinating times, fascinating discussion. Thank you so much.
Not a bit, Brian. Very nice speaking with you.
Full Comment is a Postmedia podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Proulx. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. You can subscribe to Full Comment on Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcast, and help us out. Give us a rating, leave us a review, tell your friends all about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.